I am going to introduce this session by welcoming you to this final session of the day for Library Instruction Tennessee Conference 2022. We call ourselves LIT, and LIT is a space for teaching librarians to network, collaborate, and discuss trends, issues, and innovations in library instruction and information literacy. We would like to thank Citadel Library for providing Soup access for our conference. This meeting is being recorded, and by continuing to attend this session, you are consenting to being part of this recording. These recordings with captions will be posted on the LIT website after the conference. So please all abide by our code of conduct, which may be found on the About Us page of the LIT website. If you would like to report an issue, please email us at libraryinstructiontn@gmail.com. We have disabled your microphones, so if you have questions for the speakers, and I hope you do, during the session, please place them in the chat box, and we will include them in our Q&A period at the end. Technical issues should be reported to libraryinstructiontn@gmail.com. And of course, a survey will be emailed to you after the conference concludes. So please give us feedback so we can improve your experience next year. This session is, of course, as you see on the screen, passing the baton, mastering the art of the handoff in library transitions, with the wonderful presenters, Sarah Stevenson and Melissa Mallon from Vanderbilt University. And so please, let's get lit.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that intro. I'm just going to repeat the title in case we have people coming in while we're talking. You are at Passing the Baton, Mastering the Art of the Handoff in Library Transitions. And I'm Sarah Stevenson, and I'm going to change the slide here, hopefully. Yes, it worked. I'm Sarah Stevenson. I'm the librarian for education at Vanderbilt University, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Melissa. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Melissa Mallon. I am Associate University Librarian for Teaching and Learning at Vanderbilt University, and very excited to be here.
Wonderful. So today, you may have gathered from the abstract and from our title that we are talking about library transitions and specifically what those look like in your instruction programs, thinking about bringing in new members to your instruction team and those kinds of things. We all go through transitions, or maybe you've been through a job change, or maybe you've onboarded a new team member. But it's something that Melissa and I have talked a lot about in our meetings and just have been like, there's not a lot out there that discusses how to do this well. So today, what we're hoping to do is help identify some of the stages of those transitions within an organization, kind of what that timeline looks like. And then share some strategies for how to walk through that transition period in different phases. And then finally, we want to suggest some stable and sustainable succession plan ideas that you can use in your instruction program to kind of help maintain sustainability throughout change in your organization or in your team. So that's a little bit of what we are hoping to cover today. We'll definitely share some stories of our own experiences in various roles, and also just, hopefully we can have a conversation together as well about what those transitions can look like. So a little bit more about how we're going to share this. We're going to discuss the transition, a job transition from different lenses. So, the different phases of that transition and also the different viewpoints. So we'll share about the team member that is leaving, a manager, and also the person that's coming in. So some different insights for each of those roles. And then specifically, we'll share some tips for how each member of that team can be successful in the change process.
So before we jump into some of those specifics that Sarah mentioned, we want to just get a little bit of a sense of your feelings and your experience with transitions. So this is a moment that we would like you to utilize the chat. And if you feel comfortable, just that we are recording, so maybe keep it vague if you had a bad experience. But we're wondering if you could all share, thinking about a transition that you've taken, what are some of the thoughts or behaviors or emotions or experiences that you encountered, whether you are coming into a new instruction position or maybe moving out of one, transitioning to a new position. We're just curious what the experience was like for you all. So if you would like to share on chat, we would love to see that. And I can say, Sarah alluded to this, but we have both been through many a transition ourselves in our careers. And I think Sarah probably has some really specific things she could say about transitioning right before COVID happened. But I'm seeing, things like stressful, uncertainty into the unknown. Yeah. Moving into a managerial position from more of a teaching focused position. Absolutely. Scary. So a little uncertain here, right? Floundering, that's a great word. We agree that, has often been the case with our transitions. And so part of what we want to accomplish today is to just give you some things to think about that may have already been in your head, but just to help sort of focus in so you don't feel alone, so you do feel like you have support. And then what does that look like from all of these different levels of the organization? So please keep sharing. We'll come back to some of this in a little bit. But before we get into some of the specifics of the individual roles, we wanted to share just a little bit of kind of background information, explore some definitions here. So one of the things that I think is really crucial to think about, especially if you're looking at this maybe from a managerial perspective or someone that's leading a team that has transitions happening, is that there is a difference between organizational change and transition. So Bridges has a really good way to kind of think about this, that they're really not the same thing, even though we're often always lumping change and transition together as the same phenomenon. So change in the case of organizations, in this specific case, is meant to be something that starts or stops. So sometimes that could be doing something in a different way, usually occurring in a specific time period and following a fairly logical process. So this could be creating a new service model for your instruction team, like moving from liaison-based to a team-based model. It could also be something like getting a new ILS, which we can, those of us that have been through those experiences can say is very stressful and not a fun situation. But that is something that has kind of a logic to it, and you know what's going to happen. Transition, on the other hand, is more of a psychological process that can't be managed by a single rational formula because it's too context dependent. And so if you think about any time you have a team member leave or you have a new person coming in, people are different, right? And you can't predict what that's going to be like. And so there's this sort of psychological process that you go through that's characterized by these kind of three different areas, one of which is letting go of the old situation, which can be very difficult, but even more difficult can be letting go of old identities that we maybe were holding on to as part of the previous model. Going through a neutral zone between what the old reality is, so in this case, the old team makeup, and the new reality that still may be very unclear. You don't know who your new colleague is going to be. You don't know what that looks like. And then finally, starting a new beginning that is much more than just simply kind of a new start that's required in a change, like, oh, we're not using I can't even think of any ILS examples to share, but we're using Primo now and not the old thing. That's a thing that happens. But getting a new coworker, getting a new team member, a little bit different. So this is often overlooked. And so kind of thinking about some of the dynamics that are involved in that psychological process, Ashford shares a really good example of a model, which we'll share these references. They're old, but they're classics. We'll share those with you a little bit later. But thinking about some of the stressors that may occur during organizational transitions, like when a team member leaves and a new one comes on, obviously uncertainty and disruption is going to be a big part of that process, which can really cause stress not only for individual team members, but for the team themselves. So what is the kind of ambiguity of what the makeup of that team is going to look like? And that can be from the person that's leaving, the team that is sticking around, and then the person that's coming in as well. Definitely, that the kind of stress and the unknown, who's going to do the work, how is everything going to get done, how are team dynamics going to be affected, and then definitely kind of that loss of personal control will come into play. And we'll talk more in a few minutes about the role of the manager in this kind of transition process and what that looks like, but definitely thinking about coping mechanisms that can be used by managers to help individuals sort of manage through or navigate the transition process. Definitely sharing worries and concerns prior to and during the transition is really important. And also reducing uncertainty and minimizing disruption. So being very clear about what the process is going to be, but also making sure not to add those stressors onto the team. Let the team come to you and express their concerns and stresses. We talked about this a little bit in the burnout session earlier, but if you are experiencing a change like this as a manager, don't ask your team to tell you what can stop being done. You tell them what to stop doing to help with that kind of information transfer and that overload of work and stress.
Keep losing my slides, but I'm going here. Okay, so I want to share a little bit more about the different profiles that we will be talking about, and sort of going along this idea of passing the baton. Anytime, I don't know if any of you were in track and field, I was a very long time ago and was on the relay team. And there's always different members of the team that are involved in that process. So there's a person who's taking off at the beginning of the relay race, and there's a person that's passing off the baton to the next person, and there's always a coach, the person that's kind of tracking the progress of this whole thing and helping develop the skills for that transition to be smooth. So we kind of, not to overly metaphor, but we did take that kind of idea loosely and think about it in those terms. You always have a person that's transitioning out of the role. You have a team manager, hopefully, or a person that's sort of supervising that instruction team, if you have a team. And then there's the new person that's coming in. So I want to start first by talking about the team member that is leaving the team. And so some priorities that I have identified for that person are transitioning relevant information and knowledge, wrapping up the projects that you have ongoing. You have to kind of move on. And so figuring out, what's a natural or logical endpoint so that I can step away with intention. So how do we kind of smoothly let go of the things that we've been working on and pass them off? So there's a lot of different factors that go into a person deciding to leave an organization or an institution. And some of them are positive, and sometimes they can be negative. So I just wanted to note that, it could be a new job, or maybe some external circumstances that are causing you to look for a new role. Could be that you've entered a new life stage and need something different. Sometimes it can be the work environment or the conditions that you need to leave, or as we've kind of heard as a theme today, burnout can be a factor. So there's a lot of different reasons. And so those reasons can make this transition smooth or not smooth. So I just want to point out that as I'm talking about this particular person in this transition, there can be times when it's not safe maybe to do all of these particular things. So we're kind of looking at, under the best of circumstances, you have time to think through all these things strategically. These are the things that you would do when that transition is a positive kind of change. So I just wanted to point that out, because I know that, there can be transitions that are a little bit more rocky, or, it's not necessarily going to be feasible for you to do all these things. So we don't want you to feel guilty if you're thinking about leaving, or you're in the midst of a transition and you can't do all these things. Don't feel pressure like you have to do this. It's not, the rules. These are just some things to think about that could be helpful. So thinking about that timeline of transition, we like to think about it in maybe three kind of significant chunks. So there's the things that happen pre-transition. So you're planning to leave a role. And then the interim period is you're prepping and kind of getting ready to sign off on the last things and move out of that role. And then post-transition. So what happens after you've kind of made that change, or that change has happened? So for the person that's leaving, there's a few different things that happen during each of those phases. So during pre-transition, that's really the time to, if you haven't already, to think through your documentation and all the things that you've kind of created while you've been in your instruction role. That could be, your policies and procedures. That could be your LibGuides. It's a great time to create some kind of a guide for the person that's coming in to say, here's kind of what we've been doing. And this is where it could go in the future. But obviously, that's going to be up to you as you come into this role. Another thing that you want to make sure you're doing is checking in with your partners. So we all have faculty that we work with. We have co-curricular partners that we work with. So when you know that you're going to be leaving a position, it's always helpful to be mindful of the fact that they also will be making a transition to a new person. And so letting them know, like, hey, I'm going to be leaving. This is who you can talk to in the middle of this transition. Letting them know who their point of contact is within the library is really helpful. And then you kind of move into this interim space. You want to make sure that any important email conversations you've had that kind of explain how things have happened or developed. I know we all have sometimes the meetings that take place over email, so making sure that's documented somewhere. If you have any shared accounts within your team, like we have a shared Mentimeter account, for example, if you have a team Canva, any of those kinds of shared things, making sure that somebody knows the login info and can transfer that to the new person is really important. And then sharing that documentation you've created. So I'll talk more about it in a minute here, but making sure that that's somewhere that people know where it is important. And then there's this post-transition period. So you've done all this work to help kind of set the team up for success when you leave. Then you want to look forward. Hopefully you're going to something that's exciting, that you're passionate about, and new opportunities, new challenges to look forward to. So keep your eyes forward. Whenever a person leaves a role, it can be tempting to look back and see what's happened with the projects you've worked on. And sometimes that can be disheartening if you're like, oh, wow, everything's changed, or, oh, they totally abandoned that project I was working on. I've experienced that even in transitions, in my career. I'm like, oh, that passionate project I had has now changed. The reality is someone new is coming in and they have their own unique way of being a librarian, and they're going to forge connections that maybe you didn't, and maybe do things differently, and that's okay. So it's always helpful, I feel like, Melissa, maybe you have more to add to that, but I think it's always helpful to just focus on where you're headed and not dwell too much on what maybe has changed since you left. The other thing you can do is if you're comfortable with it, offer to answer questions of the person that's coming in. So sometimes if you're moving to a role, maybe that's in the same institution, you want to have boundaries and make sure that that person is successful and they're the ones that, the faculty go to. But it can be helpful to have that person who understands the role that you can ask questions of. So if you feel comfortable, it's a nice thing to offer. It can be a nice thing to offer to that person to meet with them one time and talk to them about the role. When I started a new job several years ago, the person that I was coming in after said, "Hey, I'd love to get dinner with you sometime if you're open to it, no pressure, and just answer any questions you might have." And I found that very helpful. Of course, I was a different kind of librarian. I had different ways of doing things and different ideas, but it was helpful to hear some of the context and the history behind what had taken place on that team. So that's just some things to note.
Sarah, I think that's a really good point because that contextual stuff is not always written down or, documented anywhere. And so being able to be a friendly, person that can provide some of that history and context can be really helpful if the other person wants it, right? So never kind of forcing that on them, but just being available is really nice.
Yeah. So I want to share just a couple tips for success if you're the person that's transitioning or if you're thinking about how you might prepare to transition, going a little deeper on creating documentation. One thing that I have found, or one thing I really like to do is create kind of a master document of sorts for my person coming in and just, list who are the partners that I work with. What kind of projects have we worked on? Sort of sharing some of that contextual information. This is really helpful, especially if you're a liaison to a subject area, to just say, "Hey, here's my faculty that have been really engaged." So that they don't have to necessarily, they will forge their own partnerships, but then they don't have to maybe, at least when they're first getting started, work as hard to figure out who those allies might be. They might have it written down. That's helpful. Another thing is to document your processes. So if there are sort of external calendars or things that are helpful to know about, maybe you teach classes at a certain time of year, letting them know kind of what the flow is. That's always something that's nice to know when you're coming in. Again, taking that guesswork out for them is nice. The other thing that I would really strongly encourage you to do is clean up your files. So we have all experienced, probably all have our story of coming in either to a giant filing cabinet of mystery or a shared drive that nobody has looked at in decades. So if you have time to do so, it's just a nice thing to do to clean up your files, name them in a usable way, and get rid of things that are outdated and no one uses anymore. Again, taking that guesswork out for the new person. They don't have to wonder, "Oh, is this lesson plan still active? Do we still use this? Maybe not." It just is helpful to know what's dated and what's a current practice. So another thing you want to think about is wrapping up your projects. And now, honestly, they may not always look this pretty. You're not realistically going to be able to finish everything that you've had going on, in the time that you've been there. So I would say think about a logical stopping point, or at least letting someone know, "Hey, this is where this project is at." If you're working with a partner or an external person outside the libraries, you want to let them know as well, "Hey, I'm leaving, so I'm going to hand this off to my colleague. If you have questions, you can talk to this librarian or my supervisor, whatever, whoever the point person is for that." And then I mentioned this previously, but letting the incoming person know what those projects are and where they're at is always helpful. And the third thing I'll say is I mentioned this already, but really letting go. Once you leave, it's not your project anymore. You started it and someone is now going to take that baton and run with it. Or, maybe they'll start running on a different track and field, and that's fine too. You want to remember everyone does things differently. And I mentioned this already too, but you can leave the door open for conversation if you want to.
So what does this look like from the team manager or team lead? And in some cases, just to acknowledge, it may not be a manager of an instruction team. It could be that your one instruction librarian is leaving and you've got a new one coming on board. But generally in that kind of supervisory role, what are some of the priorities or things to focus on for that role? The biggest thing really is to think about keeping momentum. And so this could be the instruction program as a whole, whatever that looks like at your institution. It could also mean, just making sure that you're covering the bare minimum of what needs to be covered. And at the same time, making sure that you are building and maintaining the relationships that have already been created, especially by the person that is leaving their role, so that nothing kind of falls through the cracks. Well, let me say this, things will fall through the cracks. That's going to happen. Be ready for it. But if you're thinking about the kind of primary partners that Sarah mentioned and considering who you want your new librarian to make connections with, ensuring that you're not losing track of that during the interim is really important. And also just kind of thinking about the team and the continuity and what that looks like. So part of that is thinking about the big picture. So these are some of the things to consider from the managerial perspective. When you have a transition like this, it's going to be messy, it's going to be ambiguous, and you have to learn to sit with that as the manager, the team lead, but you also have to be ready to support the rest of your instruction librarians through that process as well. It's just going to be awkward, and things will slip through the cracks and nothing is going to be exactly the same as it was. So I think we sometimes forget that supervisors struggle with this kind of organizational transition as well. And so knowing that going in can help you manage both yourself and your team's expectations. Also a good time to start thinking about and kind of keeping track of the team dynamics and culture. While I would not recommend using the moment when someone new leaves and someone new comes in, or when someone leaves and someone new comes in, to be the moment to really change your team structure, it is a good time to start kind of thinking about what skills is this new librarian bringing in, and what does that mean for the way we operate as an instruction group, and what kind of changes could there be down the line, not right now. So the timeline there's some overlap here to the person leaving, but the big difference is the manager hopefully will be there in the interim, right? So they're going to be there both when the person is preparing to leave and when the new person arrives. So before your amazing colleague decides to move on to their new exciting position, so I'm going optimism here that it's a positive experience for everyone. Talk to them. Meet with them. Sarah mentioned documentation. We're going to talk about documentation a lot. And I think, some of you mentioned that as being one of your big issues with coming into a new role. Making sure that everything is written down that needs to be written down. Also creating a plan or at least a framework for how you're going to distribute the workload amongst the remaining staff. And again, I mentioned this already, but be ready to tell the team, this is what we're going to let go of. This is where we can kind of step away, rather than having to put the burden on them to tell you, oh, well, maybe I can stop doing this because that's too much stress to add on. So be ready for that. And just be open and transparent, ask questions, find out from your librarian where the areas of potential challenges or successes for their successor might be, and then be ready to communicate that. In the middle, in that kind of in-between time, this is a point where you're really going to need to check in with your team, maybe on a more regular basis than you had previously, doing those kind of temperature, excuse me, vibe checks, but also remembering what Ashford said. I mentioned this earlier, of not overloading the team with too much information. Just help them kind of see what they need to see and then be ready to share other things with them if they ask. Also get ready to do some teaching. Step in, be ready to, sit at the reference desk, go cover some classes. Again, you're never going to be able to keep up with the work of an entire position, but not putting that all on the rest of the team and taking on some of that work yourself is going to really help the team move forward in a more productive and positive way. And then finally, when the new person arrives, making sure that your first plan of action is to onboard and welcome them into the library environment. I think that's really important for setting the stage, not immediately thrusting them into the classroom or saying, you need to go to all of these department meetings, but being ready to help them just realize where they're working now and who they're working with and what that looks like. Checking in with them on a regular basis. And a tip that I've always found helpful for myself when I come into a new role, but also when I've managed people that come into a new role, is let them sort of dictate how often they want to meet. So I would be happy meeting, doing a check-in every day if that worked for them. But that's also a lot, and that might be too overwhelming or feel kind of micromanagey. And so you want to give them the opportunity to say, you know what, could we check in, once a week or something like that, just to help them get settled. And then the big thing here, and you're going to hear me mention this again, but ownership. Really making sure that the new librarian feels like they are a part of the team, that this is their area now, and what does that look like as they're starting to take over the teaching responsibilities. So a couple of tips for success to get through some of these factors. Again, with the relationships, making sure that from the beginning, the partners that you have on campus or that are working with your teaching librarian are involved in the process. So inviting them to serve on the search committee, to come to candidate presentations, to be part of that can help build some community even before the new person arrives, and gives them a chance to get some sort of immediate buy-in and know who they can reach out to. While you're doing all that as the manager or team lead, you're also going to department meetings. You're going to maybe sign up for a departmental newsletter, or make sure that you're still getting that information. So you're ready to share that with the new person when they arrive. Again, you don't want to tell them everything because some of it may not be relevant, or, could be like 2 months ago news and who cares in another couple of months. But just being able to kind of filter through that and know like, oh, this is probably like, oh, there's a new department chair, or there's a new, something or another, new curriculum that's coming up. Those are the kind of things that you want to prepare them with, so they don't have to play a bunch of catch up when they come along. And then also, without going overboard, one of the things I found really helpful for me when I started this position was that the team here had already set up some meetings for me before. They knew when I was coming, and so they had, created some meetings with department heads and with some faculty, and that was so nice to just have like, okay, there's some things on my calendar that I know I'm going to go to, and this is where I'm expected to be. And I didn't have to figure that out all on my own was super helpful. So kind of thinking about that a little bit too for the new person. What does that look like? Above all, again, you want to create a welcoming and encouraging environment for your entire team, but especially the new person that's coming on board. So this was mentioned in the chat earlier, but not really having someone to connect with, not having someone to help you kind of understand the norms of this new environment that they're in. So whether your library has a informal or formal mentoring process, or maybe nothing like that at all, as a manager, you can help sort of connect your new librarian with someone that they can turn to and ask those weird questions about like, well, where does everyone eat lunch? Or how long do you mostly teach classes? And how do I get a LibGuides account? And all of those kind of things that you're sort of presetting the stage for and giving them a support system there. Speaking of LibGuides, please change everything to the new person's name before they arrive. There's nothing worse than to show up at a new job. You're excited, you're ready to go, and everyone's like, oh, well, this handout still is mentioning, the last person that was in this role. That's super awkward for the new person. And also, to Sarah's point earlier, it makes it kind of awkward for the person that's leaving because their stuff is still kind of out there and maybe he's being adopted by someone else and it's just awkward all around. So I think that there's a big piece of that to just have that all ready to go, turn it over. And then finally, getting your team, the rest of the instruction team on board so that they're not, I think we've all heard this, right? Like, don't call them the new so-and-so. So, we tried very hard not to let anyone call Sarah the new Leanne when she came around because it's not fair and it's not, it's just awkward for everyone and super, super awkward for the person that's coming on board. So making sure that you are very clear about that and giving them plenty of space to own the job as their own because that's why you hired them. You want them around. So you want to give them that space. And then finally, helping the new librarian think about the organizational context. And part of this could be through a mentoring relationship, if that works. But also just making sure that they know where to find information. So Sarah mentioned the need to document for the person leaving their role. Where is that documentation? And making sure that everyone on the team, including, the manager and the new person arriving, can find that information. Again, using this as a moment to kind of think through how the team works together. And you could also be thinking about that from kind of that interim gap perspective. Is there an opportunity for existing team members to maybe learn a few new things, to use their skills in different ways so that they'll feel more ownership and comfort when their new colleague arrives? And then finally, just creating, that environment to provide those perspectives, encourage and celebrate the new, fresh perspectives, and giving them opportunities to say, like, well, this is how maybe I, did orientations in my previous job, or these are some ideas that I've always wanted to try, and then try them and make it a space to feel comfortable and safe.
All right. So moving on for our last little section here, thinking about the new team member. So if you're coming in, I know a lot of you expressed it was stressful or kind of not sure what to do. And so I think if the person that's leaving has done some of these things, it can be really helpful because you walk into having some context documented and hopefully a manager who can help you walk through that process. But that isn't always the case. That's sort of best case scenario. Sometimes you do walk in and find a filing cabinet or two full of printed out emails. I have been there and I'm sure that some of you have as well. So how do you get oriented to this new space? And what are some ways to do that? So I would say priority is really to get to know this new context. And when I say context, I mean, the people that you're working with, the partners that you have. Also, though, there's this physical space, unless you're coming in during the virtual period of time, but getting to know your campus, your building, where the office supplies, all those kinds of things are important. How do I use the copy machine? So when you're first getting started, you have these kind of high level, like, how do I do my job things? But you also have these contextual knowledge practices you kind of have to build as well. So focus on kind of getting to know your new home. Also, you want to work on developing new relationships. So seeking out one-on-ones or group conversations with faculty to get to know them a little bit and let them get to know you as well. And then I would say the third thing is your priority is to ask a lot of questions. Sometimes newer librarians may be hesitant to ask questions. So that's a good tip for managers, is just to invite that regularly and say, what can I do to support you? Do you have any questions? What are you wondering about? Those kinds of things can invite that. So there are a lot of reasons, again, why people come in to the team, similar to why people leave. There's a new opportunity, maybe some career growth potential, or maybe something about the job description. Hopefully something about the job description is very exciting to them. So you want to keep that at the forefront of your mind when you're coming in, as you're getting maybe a little stressed about all the different things to leave. Give yourself a lot of space, be compassionate towards yourself, to take the time you need to learn the new place. And remember that it's as with everything we teach, it's a process. So don't expect to know it all your first week, and don't feel like you're failing somehow if you haven't. So that transition timeline looks a little different if you're coming into a job. So none of these things are obviously required because you haven't started working there yet, but it can be helpful to prepare yourself mentally for the role. Take care of yourself. If you have time to take space in between jobs, we can't always do that, but if you have some downtime in between, especially if you've moved, do take time to get settled and to relax and refresh a little bit. And then think about what questions you might have for your new manager or teammates. Typically, for librarian positions, we've gone through this intense interview process, but you don't always remember all the things that you asked, in that interview, but you also might have new things that have come up to get oriented to your new space and place. So be thinking about what questions you might have just initially. And if you're really feeling ambitious, you can make a list of people you'd like to connect with. Obviously, again, you do not have to do this, but if you're an overachiever like me, you might find it interesting to look at websites and get familiar with things. And then once you've started, Melissa talked about these things, but meet with your manager and again, ask questions. And I'll probably repeat that again. So being mindful of our time here. Tips for success, again, get oriented to your space. Take the time you need to get moved into your office, and ask for what you need. So hopefully you will have been asked what you might need to be successful, but if not, don't be afraid to ask for it. Locate all the things, set up tours for yourself to go visit other departments. One thing I loved when I came to Vanderbilt is Melissa was really great about saying, hey, let's go visit this building today and we'll go meet the people there. And that was really helpful to establish connections with the partners that I was going to meet, just kind of in an informal way to go pop into their offices and say hi. And then review organizational materials, websites, all that documentation that was prepared for you. Hopefully, take time, give yourself time, schedule in your calendar, time to read all that stuff and to get familiar with what's there. And I said, get to know people. So go strategize who you might want to meet with. Get to know your team members, go out to coffee with them or chat with them. Follow your colleagues on social media. I always like to go and find my faculty and try to connect with them in that space just to see what they're interested in researching. Go to events as applicable. And, I love to just set up really quick little chats. I came into my role mostly virtually because of the pandemic. And so instead of going out to coffee with people, I was like, hey, can we meet for 20 minutes over Zoom? I'd love to hear about your program. And that was a pretty effective strategy for connecting with faculty. So the third thing is just sift through all that stuff. You'll probably have inherited some things. And so go through them and make them your own. Don't be afraid to make them your own. Right.
Yeah, I was telling Sarah when we were planning for this that when I started a previous job, it was like at the transition when we used Gobi for book ordering, and they had still been getting all of those little paper slips, and there were 2 filing cabinets full of paper Gobi slips of books that had been bought from like a decade ago, and it was the most overwhelming thing because I didn't know what they were and I didn't know if I was supposed to keep them or not. So I just might add, don't be afraid to recycle things that you don't think you're going to need. And to just sort of wrap us up here, kind of thinking about this handoff again from the sort of bigger picture, you heard a lot of overlaps because there are things like documentation and asking questions and communicating that are so important for everyone involved in any kind of transition. And remembering that that needs to happen prior to the transition, during the interim, and then after the transition occurs, because it is, to the point of that kind of psychological process, it's not linear and there's no rational formula there. So you need to be keeping up with all of that throughout the entire process. And just for everyone, but especially both for yourself, wherever you are in this transition, and for the manager as well, promoting that idea of psychological safety and making sure that everybody involved feels comfortable and can share their concerns, whether that's through regular check-ins or even some sort of anonymous, feedback mechanism, really important for all pieces of the process. And then again, kind of thinking through what that means for the team, if your team is small or big or whatever that looks like, both from an onboarding perspective and just, making sure everyone can have opportunities to use their skills in ways that work for them and fulfill their professional passions. And so we're really curious to hear from you all again. So we don't have a lot of time left here. So if you would like to share some responses to these questions, otherwise we would really like you to just kind of internalize them, and maybe, not that we're giving you homework or anything, but some things to think about to take with you after the session. If you are involved in a transition or you have one happening, soon at your organization, what's something concretely that you can do now at this very moment to prepare for that? And then what are some of the kind of strategies that we've talked about today that you can employ to help strengthen your team and your instruction program so it's ready for those inevitable transitions? So if you have anything you'd like to share about that, we'd love to hear it. Or this is a great time to ask us any questions. And thank you. Or if you want to share horror stories of what was left in your office when you got there, that's always kind of interesting to hear. One of my colleagues found a bottle of whiskey in a file cabinet, so that was probably a lot more exciting than book slips.
That's funny. I found like a little census football. I think must have been a giveaway from the former census librarian that it was stuffed in the wall. It was very strange. And a lot of cords for nothing that I still had in my office.
Mysterious cardigan. Yep. I'd be surprised if there wasn't a couple of those floating around the libraries.
Oh, no, nail clippings. Oh, no. Yeah. We should have added, if it's within your power, clean that office for them before they get there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's not feasible to clean out everything, but at least no nail clippings. Oh gosh.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for mentioning that about the employees' calendars. I think that there's something, without overreaching, right, and kind of trying to force meetings on people, there's just something comforting knowing that someone's kind of keeping an eye on that for you and that you don't have to be overwhelmed with Outlook the minute you get into a new role.
I also agree with you that the absence of anything in your calendar can be a little bit overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It makes you feel like you have movement forward.
Leslie, I love that perspective of retirement. So that is kind of like you're not forced out. You don't have the next job to be looking ahead to necessarily, but you do have a career of accomplishments that you want to celebrate and share with others. So I love that idea to kind of have a journal of reflections, and especially if you have ideas for strengthening the program. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And or a vacation planner, right? You could think about where all the cool things you're going to do in retirement.
Great. We are at our time today, and I don't see anything else in chat. So I have the great honor to thank you both, Sarah and Melissa, for this amazing and engaging presentation. And I am going to refer back to it often myself because it was very deeply meaningful to me in my work. And I also want to thank everyone for your attendance today. This is our final formal session at LIT 2022, and the recording for this session and many others will be available on our website after the conference, so check back. We'll also have our survey, of course, to assess our sessions, and we really hope that you'll take the time to complete those surveys. Your feedback is very important to us, and we do use it as we strategize for future LIT conference sessions too. I do want to remind you all that there is an informal gathering at 5 p.m. Eastern where we are just going to chat about our experiences today, and we encourage everyone to please join us, presenter, attendee, whatever your role. We want to engage with you and keep learning. I'm going to post a link to how to join that session in the chat to make it easy for you. Thank you all.